There comes a time in every person's life when the mask finally slips and you see the truth for what it is. You realize that the endless confusion, the self-doubt, the exhaustion, none of it was your fault. It was all part of someone else's game, designed to keep you small, to make you question your worth, and to feed their fragile ego. But the moment you woke up, the game ended. You stopped explaining yourself. You stopped chasing apologies that were never coming. You stopped bending yourself into shapes just to be accepted by someone who could never truly see you. That was the day your power returned to you. You began to rise, not with anger, but with clarity. You learned that silence can be stronger than confrontation, that peace can be the loudest form of victory. You didn't need to expose them or prove what they did. Your healing became the proof. The same tactics that once broke you became meaningless, powerless, empty, because once you understand the game, you can't be played anymore. You became untouchable not because you built walls, but because you finally understood your worth. And when you stand in that truth, no manipulation, no illusion, and no mind game can ever take your light again. There was a time when you believed that love meant sacrifice, that understanding someone's pain meant tolerating their cruelty, that loyalty required losing pieces of yourself. You thought if you just tried harder, communicated better, gave more compassion, they would finally change. But what you didn't see then was that the bond you were trying to protect was not love, it was control disguised as connection. You were caught in invisible chains, built from guilt, fear, and hope. The kind that wraps softly at first, then tightens each time you try to breathe freely. You began to notice the patterns. The subtle put-downs followed by sudden affection, the way your achievements became threats and your confidence became something they needed to break. Every time you stood up for yourself, you were told you were too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. Slowly, you began to shrink, editing your own thoughts, walking on eggshells in your own life. That is the quiet power of manipulation. It convinces you that your pain is your fault. But deep inside, a spark of truth was waiting, small but unyielding, whispering that you were not broken. Only bound then came the moment of awakening, not dramatic, but quietly revolutionary. Maybe it was the day you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back, or the moment you realized that no apology would ever come, and it no longer mattered. You began to see that their control only worked when you sought their approval. The very validation you were chasing was the weapon being used against you. That realization cracked the illusion. It didn't free you instantly, but it gave you the first breath of strength you had felt in a long time. And with that breath, you began to pull at the chains. Each act of reclaiming yourself was small but powerful, saying no without guilt, choosing silence over explanation, walking away from the chaos instead of trying to fix it. You started to remember who you were before their voice echoed in your mind. You began to rebuild your boundaries, not as walls to keep the world out, but as gates to protect your peace. And every time you enforced one, you felt the weight of control grow lighter until it no longer defined you. You learned that freedom is not found in revenge or validation, it's found in detachment, in knowing that your worth doesn't depend on anyone's recognition of it. As you walked away, something shifted within you. You stopped seeing yourself as a survivor and started recognizing yourself as a creator of your life, your happiness, your reality. The same mind games that once left you confused became lessons in discernment. You saw manipulation for what it was, weakness disguised as power, and in that awareness, you became untouchable. You broke the chains not by fighting the narcissist, but by choosing yourself, by standing in truth so firmly that no lie could reach you anymore, by realizing that your peace is the final word that ends every game they ever tried to play. There was a point when life felt like a storm that never ended, when you moved through each day carrying invisible wounds that no one else could see. You had been hurt, manipulated, and made to feel small by someone who fed on your light while convincing you that you were the problem. You lost touch with who you were, shrinking to fit into the image they wanted you to be. Every decision felt like walking through fog, every thought questioned, every emotion doubted. You became a stranger to yourself, surviving instead of living, existing in a space where your power had been silenced, but never destroyed. Then something within you began to stir. Not loud, not sudden, but steady and determined. It was the part of you that refused to die, the inner knowing that whispered that you were meant for more than pain. You began to question the story you had been told, the one where you were the broken one, the overreactor, the unworthy. You started to see that the narrative was never yours. It was planted in you by someone who needed you weak to feel strong. That awareness became the first spark of your awakening. You realized that the victim within you was not your true identity, it was a temporary state, a moment in your journey, not your destination. Reclaiming your power began in silence, in those quiet moments when you chose to believe yourself again. You started to trust your feelings, to honor your intuition, to listen to the voice that had been drowned out for so long. You began to set boundaries, not to protect yourself from the world, but to protect your energy, your peace, your truth. Each boundary became an act of self-respect. Each act of self-respect a declaration that you were no longer available for anything that diminished you. The fear of losing people turned into the strength of finding yourself. You stopped asking for permission to be who you are and started walking in your truth unapologetically. You began to rebuild your identity piece by piece, remembering the parts of yourself that had been forgotten. The laughter, the curiosity, the creativity, the courage, they were all still there, waiting for you to return. Healing was not about erasing the past, but transforming it into wisdom. You started to understand that what you went through was not a punishment but a preparation, a process that shaped you into someone unshakable. The pain that once defined you became the fuel for your strength. You were no longer the person who tolerated chaos to keep peace. You became the person who embodied peace even in chaos, and in that transformation, you discovered your true power, the kind that doesn't need validation, control, or revenge. It's the quiet power of self-awareness, the calm confidence of someone who knows their worth without needing to prove it. You rose not in anger, but in clarity. You walked forward not to show them what they lost, but to live what you gained. You turned the pain into purpose, the wounds into wisdom, the darkness into light. You stopped being the story of what happened to you and became the author of what comes next. The victor who stands not above others, but firmly within their own strength, unshaken, unbroken, and free. There comes a moment when everything that once confused you suddenly becomes clear, when the fog that kept you trapped begins to lift and you finally see the pattern for what it is. You start to recognize that the love you were fighting for was never real love. It was control wrapped in charm, kindness used as a tool, apologies delivered only to reset the game. You replay every conversation, every silent treatment, every time you were blamed for simply reacting to pain, and you see the manipulation not as proof of your weakness, but as evidence of how deeply you cared. The turning point is not loud. It is quiet, almost sacred, a private realization that you no longer need to understand why they did what they did. Because the answer no longer matters, you stop trying to decode their words and start listening to your own. The tension in your body begins to ease because you are no longer fighting to be understood by someone who never wanted to understand you. You notice the power shift happening inside you each time they try to provoke a reaction. You find yourself responding with calm, not because you are indifferent, but because you are done playing. You realize that silence is not weakness, it is mastery. It is the refusal to hand over your peace, Their manipulation loses its grip not when they stop, but when you stop feeding it with your attention, your energy, your need for closure. You begin to see how they thrived on confusion, how every argument had a purpose to keep you off balance, to make you question your own memory, to make you doubt your perception of reality. But the moment you anchor yourself in truth, their tactics start to fail. You remember who you are beyond their version of you. You stop internalizing their accusations and start recognizing projection. You learn that someone's inability to love you properly has nothing to do with your worth. The guilt that once chained you becomes lighter. The shame that once silenced you begins to dissolve. You are not reacting anymore. You are observing. And from that space of awareness, their power fades into nothingness. There is freedom in detachment. A deep, steady freedom that doesn't come from revenge, but from release. You begin to choose peace over drama, clarity over confusion, truth over illusion. You no longer explain your boundaries or defend your decisions. You know what you saw, what you felt, and that is enough. The energy that once went into trying to fix them now flows into healing yourself. You begin to rebuild your sense of safety from the inside out. You notice how much lighter life feels without the constant emotional tug-of-war. You start to smile again, not because everything is perfect, but because you are free, and that is when you realize the true meaning of the turning point. It was never about them losing control. It was about you reclaiming your mind, your heart, your peace. It was about understanding that manipulation only works on the parts of you that doubt your own truth. The moment you stood in your truth, their grip loosened. The game ended, not with confrontation, but with awakening, because when you became aware, you became untouchable. There was a time when chaos felt normal, when constant tension and emotional unpredictability were mistaken for love, when peace felt like an unfamiliar silence that made you uneasy. You were conditioned to believe that walking on eggshells was a part of connection, that your emotional balance depended on someone else's mood. Every argument, every manipulation, every emotional storm chipped away at your sense of safety. You found yourself living in reaction mode, constantly bracing for the next wave of criticism or withdrawal. But deep inside, there was always a quiet part of you that longed for peace, not the temporary calm that came after an apology, but the kind of peace that could not be shaken by anyone's chaos. The journey to that peace began the moment you decided you were no longer going to match their energy. You stopped explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped engaging in conversations that only led to confusion and pain. You began to build what can only be described as emotional armor, not made of cold detachment, but of awareness. It was the kind of strength that allowed you to observe without absorbing, to care without being consumed, to love without losing yourself. You learned that your calmness was not weakness, it was protection. You understood that you could not control other people's behavior, but you could control your response, and that simple truth became your power as you practiced detachment. You started to feel your energy returning. The chaos that once pulled you in now seemed distant, almost irrelevant. You stopped needing to prove your worth through arguments, stopped seeking validation from those incapable of giving it. You began to protect your inner world as if it were sacred ground, choosing peace even when provoked, choosing silence even when misunderstood. That is when your healing deepened, not when others changed, but when you stopped letting their storms dictate your weather. You began to rebuild trust with yourself, realizing that your intuition had always been right. The more you trusted that inner voice, the less influence external noise had over you. Your emotional armor grew stronger with every boundary you honored and every reaction you refused to give. You began to understand that self-control was not suppression, it was self-respect. You no longer let temporary emotions create permanent chaos. When others tried to draw you back into the old patterns of drama and blame, you stood still in your peace. You saw how their attempts to provoke you lost power when met with calmness. You discovered that true strength was not in fighting back, but in refusing to be dragged into battles that cost your peace. What once triggered you became a test of your growth, and every time you passed that test, your inner light grew brighter, and in that quiet strength you found freedom. The chaos that once defined your days became a distant memory, replaced by a sense of inner stability that no one could shake. You realized that peace was not something you found outside yourself, but something you built within moment by moment, boundary by boundary, truth by truth. You rose above not by hardening your heart, but by softening into awareness, by choosing to be guided by wisdom instead of wounds, by understanding that your serenity is your greatest rebellion against everything that once tried to break you. There comes a stage in your journey when you realize that the power you were searching for was never outside of you. It was waiting quietly within, beneath the layers of fear, pain, and self-doubt that others planted in your mind. You spent so much time trying to be enough for people who were never capable of seeing your worth, giving your energy to situations that only drained your spirit. You believed that love required sacrifice, that kindness meant tolerance, that being good meant staying silent. But there comes a breaking point where your soul refuses to live small any longer, where your pain transforms into purpose, and your boundaries become sacred. That is when you begin to rise, not as the version of yourself shaped by others, but as the one you were always meant to be. Becoming untouchable does not mean you build walls. It means you learn to walk through the world with open eyes and an unshaken heart. You understand that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the mastery of response. The same situations that once shattered you no longer hold power, because you no longer depend on anyone to define your worth. You stop chasing closure from those who broke you, because you realize that healing was never their responsibility. You begin to forgive, not to excuse their behavior, but to release yourself from the grip of resentment. Forgiveness becomes freedom, detachment becomes clarity, and silence becomes strength. The things that once provoked you now teach you. The people who once drained you now reveal the boundaries you needed to set you start living from a place of alignment instead of survival. Your energy shifts, and so does everything around you. You no longer fear being alone, because solitude feels like peace, not punishment. You find joy in your own company, power in your stillness, and courage in your authenticity. You begin to see how the universe responds to your energy when you stop chasing. What is meant for you flows naturally. You stop explaining your growth to those who prefer the old version of you, because you know that not everyone is meant to walk with you into this next chapter. You no longer carry the need to prove anything, because your presence itself becomes proof of your evolution. Fear loses its hold because you no longer live through the lens of other people's opinions. You have walked through pain and come out wiser, softer, and stronger. You have learned that your peace is your power and your truth is your protection. You no longer allow guilt to guide your decisions or manipulation to shape your emotions. You are no longer reactive, you are intentional. You move through life with grace, knowing that your energy is precious and not everyone deserves access to it. The chaos that once consumed you becomes background noise, because you are centered in something deeper: self-respect, clarity, and faith in your path. And this is what it means to be untouchable, to live free from the need for validation, fearless in your authenticity, fully empowered by the lessons that once broke you. You are no longer the person who settles, explains, or waits to be chosen. You are the one who chooses peace, protects your energy, and walks with quiet confidence, knowing that no mind game, no manipulation, and no shadow from the past can touch the light you now carry within, and now, as you stand on the other side of everything that once tried to break you, you see how far you've come. You no longer live in reaction to the pain. You live in response to your truth. The chaos that once surrounded you has become a distant echo, and in its place there is clarity, balance, and strength. You have learned that real power is not about control or revenge, it is about peace. It is the calm confidence of knowing who you are and no longer allowing anyone to define that for you. You walk through life differently now, with grounded energy and quiet certainty. You don't need to prove your worth because you embody it. You don't need to explain your boundaries because you live them. You understand that the freedom you feel today came from the courage to let go, to heal, and to rise. The narcissist's games ended the moment you reclaimed your mind, your heart, and your peace. You are no longer the wounded one trying to survive. You are the awakened one choosing to thrive. Untouchable not because you are hard, but because you are whole, radiant, and finally free.